The soil told her 3 days before anyone else knew. She felt it through her palms, pressed flat against cracked Sahel earth at dawn, a trembling that had no business being there. Not seismic, not natural. Something beneath the dead land was moving, and it was moving with intention. By the time she reached the excavation site, 2 kingdoms were already celebrating. They thought they'd found a gift. They were pulling ancient stones from the earth like teeth from a sleeping mouth, laughing, declaring it providence, declaring it theirs, and nobody was asking why the builders had sealed it shut in the first place. She knew why. She'd spent her whole life reading what water does when it's forced somewhere it doesn't want to go. And what she felt beneath that ground wasn't a river, it was a redirected sky, an entire rainfall system, engineered, weaponized, and deliberately buried by a civilization that looked at what they had built and chose, consciously, to lock it away forever. They chose silence over power, and these kingdoms were about to undo that choice in a single afternoon. She had maybe 72 hours before the cascade became irreversible, before the interior savanna stopped receiving rain, not for a season, not for a decade, permanently. The land wouldn't flood, it wouldn't burn, it would simply be forgotten by the sky. And the man she needed to stop it, the only person alive who understood how these structures breathed, was standing on the other side of the excavation, working for them. Stay with us, because what these kingdoms accidentally uncovered maps almost exactly onto one of archaeology's most debated unsolved mysteries, a massive, unattributed ancient infrastructure system beneath the West African Sahel that no civilization has ever claimed. A daisy pressed both palms flat against the cracked earth. The sun had not yet risen. The Sahel stretched in every direction, pale, still, and silent. Nothing moved out here at this hour. Nothing was supposed to move. But something was. She felt it travel up through her wrists, a low, rhythmic pulse. Not an animal, not the wind. This was structural. It had a pattern. It had a mind. She pulled her hands back and looked at her palms. The skin was dusty, normal. She pressed down again. There it was, a trembling below the surface, deep and slow, like something enormous breathing underground. A daisy sat back on her heels and opened her field notebook. She wrote 3 words: not natural, intentional. She had been a water diviner for 14 years. She had read soil in the Igbo highlands, in river deltas, in dying marshlands. She had learned to separate what the earth produced on its own from what humans had done to it. This trembling was not the earth speaking. This was an echo, something built, something old, sending a signal. She packed her instruments into her leather satchel. She stood and looked north. Historical research into unexplained ground vibrations across the central Sahel had always been dismissed. Scientists called it seismic noise. Local scholars called it myth. Nobody had ever brought a water diviner to a seismology meeting. That was the problem with expertise. It only trusted itself. She started walking north. The pulse grew slightly stronger with every step. She marked the direction in her notebook with a small arrow. By midday, she would reach the site where 2 kingdoms had been digging for 3 weeks. She had heard about the excavation through a trader passing through her village. The trader said they had found old stones, beautiful, carved, perfectly fitted stones running in long lines beneath the sand. A daisy had felt sick when she heard that. Perfectly fitted stones running in lines beneath sand did not mean ruins, not always. Sometimes it meant pipes. She walked faster. The archaeological evidence being reported from that site did not match any known burial structure or settlement pattern she had studied. The stones were too regular, too deep, too deliberate. Someone had built something down there, and someone else, a very long time ago, had buried it. Those were two very different decisions, and only one of them made sense if you were afraid of what you had made. She checked her compass, still north. Behind her, the sun finally broke over the horizon. It turned the sand gold for exactly 4 minutes. Then the light flattened, and the Sahel went pale again. Kofi Abini crouched inside the excavation trench and ran his finger along the stone joint. The fit was perfect. 0 gap, no mortar. He pressed his thumbnail into the seam. Nothing. He pulled out his measuring tool and confirmed the angle of the bevel cut. 14 degrees. He wrote it down. He measured the next joint. 14 degrees again. He sat back against the trench wall and looked at the line of stones running east to west, disappearing into unexcavated sand on both ends. His guild had taught him to read structures the way a doctor reads bone. Every building made decisions. Every joint told you what the builder was thinking. And these builders, whoever they were, had been thinking about pressure. The bevel cut at 14 degrees was not decorative. It was a seal design. It was built to hold something in or to keep something directed. Kofi had designed cooling structures in Timbuktu and Guinea. He understood how ancient West African engineers manipulated airflow and fluid dynamics using nothing but geometry and material knowledge. His guild had preserved those techniques for 11 generations. But this was different. This was not a cooling chamber. This was not a cistern. The sheer scale of it, the stones ran for at least 2 kilometers in each direction based on the survey data, suggested a network, a system. He stood and looked up at the kingdom officials gathered at the trench edge above him. They were smiling. The lead official, a broad man in deep orange robes, had announced that morning that this was a great gift, a water delivery system sent by the ancestors. Kofi had not said anything then. He was still not sure what to say now. The historical research he had read on pre-Islamic West African hydraulic engineering was incomplete. There were gaps, large gaps that scholars had attributed to colonial archival destruction. But Kofi had always suspected the gaps were older than that some knowledge had been deliberately removed from the record long before any foreign hand touched it. He took photographs of the joint. He sketched the bevel profile. He measured the interior diameter of the channel from what was visible, approximately 60 centimeters, and calculated the flow capacity. The number that came back stopped him cold. At full capacity, this channel could move enough subsurface moisture to affect regional precipitation patterns across a radius of 400 kilometers. He checked the calculation twice. Same answer. He looked at the stone again. Then he looked at the thick, deliberate seal cap that had been cracked open 3 days ago by the kingdom's workers. It had taken 4 men with iron tools to break that seal. The builders had not wanted it opened. That thought settled in his chest like a stone dropping into still water. He climbed out of the trench. He needed to look at the satellite topography maps again, and he needed to talk to someone. Adaze heard the celebration before she saw the excavation. Drums, laughter, the high sound of a horn being blown in short bursts. She crested a low dune and stopped. Below her, Two camps faced each other across a wide trench line. Flags flew in different colors, the deep green of the Sokoto Federation on the left, the black and gold of the Kanem Council on the right. Between them, a shared excavation site stretched for nearly 300 meters. Workers moved in lines, passing stone segments up from the trench. Officials stood at tables covered in maps. A cooking fire burned at each camp. It looked like a festival. Adaze counted the open chambers. She could see 7 breach points where the original seal caps had been removed. 7 openings. The trembling she had felt before dawn was stronger here. She could feel it through her sandals now. She walked down the dune. A guard stopped her at the perimeter. She showed her commission papers from the Igbo Water Survey Office. The guard looked at them without reading and waved her through. Nobody was turning away observers today. The officials wanted witnesses. They wanted the world to see what they had found. She moved to the nearest open chamber and looked down. The stone channel was dry at the surface, but she could feel moisture in the air coming up from below. That was not normal. Dry stone channels in the Sahel did not produce humidity. There was no surface water source within 60 kilometers. She pulled out her moisture meter and lowered it into the chamber on a string. The reading came back, 73% relative humidity at 4 meters depth. She wrote the number down and did not allow herself to react. A voice behind her said, "You're measuring humidity." She turned. A man in dusty, sand-colored work shirt was looking at her instrument with recognition, not curiosity. She said, "Yes." He said, "I calculated flow capacity this morning. I think we have a problem." She looked at him. His hands were marked with graphite from sketching. He had the look of someone who had just arrived at a conclusion they didn't want. She recognized that look. She wore it herself most mornings. She said, "What's your number?" He said, 400 kilometers of precipitation influence at full capacity. She turned back to the chamber. She lowered the moisture meter again, this time to 6 meters. The reading came back, 81%. The humidity was increasing with depth. The system was not dormant, it was active. It had been active, slowly and continuously for however long it had been buried. And now 7 chambers were open to the surface. She said, without turning around, "How many more seal caps are scheduled to be removed this week?" The man behind her was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 14. She closed her eyes. 14 more openings on top of 7 already breached. 21 access points into a system that was already running. She turned and looked at him directly. She said, "We need to talk, not here." They sat in Kofi's work tent at the edge of the Kanem camp. He spread his topography maps across the low table. She spread her moisture readings beside them. For a while, neither spoke. They just read each other's data. The tent walls shifted in the dry wind. Outside, workers were singing. Adaze put her finger on the map. "Show me where all the breach points are." Kofi marked each one with a small red dot. 7 dots, spread along the main channel line. He then marked the 14 scheduled breach points with orange dots. 21 dots total, scattered across a 300-meter stretch. Adaze traced the channel line east, then west, extending it beyond the map's edge with her finger. Where does it go? West, into what's now the central Mauritanian basin, Kofi said. East, the survey data gets unclear, but based on the stone grade and flow direction, I think it runs toward the Lake Chad watershed. Adeze pulled out her own topographic sketches, hand-drawn from memory and field observation over years of work. She laid them over his printed maps. Her lines matched his within acceptable margins. The channel system ran beneath one of the driest corridors in West Africa, connecting two ancient water zones. She said, "It's not connecting them, it's redirecting between them." Kofi looked at her sketch more carefully. She said, "Think about the bevel cuts you found. 14 degrees. You told me that's a directional seal design." "Yes," he said, "to maintain pressure gradient." "Toward which end?" He pointed west, toward Mauritania. She sat back. "Then the eastern watershed is being slowly drained. Subsurface moisture is being pulled west and held there. That's what's producing the humidity readings in the open chambers. We're seeing the pressure releasing." Kofi was quiet. He picked up his pencil and did a calculation on the margin of the map. He showed it to her. At the current rate, with 7 chambers open, the eastern pressure is venting faster than the western end can hold. If we open 14 more access points, the entire gradient collapses. She looked at his numbers. She checked them with her own method. Same result. A gradient collapse in this system would not just stop the water redistribution, it would invert it. The system would equalize violently, pulling moisture from all directions toward the channel network and then losing it to surface evaporation through the 21 open chambers. She said very carefully, the interior savanna would lose its subsurface moisture reserve. He said, in approximately 8 to 12 growing seasons. And rain patterns? He picked up the pencil again and drew 2 arrows, one pointing down from the sky toward the savanna, one stopping above it, curving away. He said, without subsurface moisture to drive convection, rain in the interior drops, not gradually, sharply. She stared at his 2 arrows, a sky that curved away, rain that simply stopped arriving. Outside the tent, the workers were still singing. The officials were still celebrating. 14 more seal caps were scheduled to be removed, starting at dawn tomorrow. She said, "We have tonight." He nodded. Tonight. She folded her sketches and stood up, then stopped sitting down. There was an old woman who lived in a settlement 3 kilometers from the site. Adeze had heard her name mentioned twice, quietly, by workers who did not know they were being listened to. The old woman was called Mama Tiga. She was not a queen. She was not a priestess. She was a groundskeeper, a woman who had tended the land around the buried structure for 40 years without knowing exactly what she was tending. Adeze walked to her settlement alone in the last hour before dusk. Mama Tiga was sitting outside her mud brick house, sorting millet. She was small and very old, with hands that moved without looking. She looked up when Adeze arrived and said nothing. Adeze sat in the dust across from her and said, "You know what's underground." Mama Tiga kept sorting millet. "I know what it does when it's angry." Adeze waited. The old woman set down her sorting tray. She pointed east. 3 droughts in my grandmother's time. Each one came from the ground, not from the sky. My grandmother said that is how you know the difference between a sky drought and a ground drought. A sky drought kills your crops. A ground drought kills your trees. Adeze felt her chest tighten. Trees had deeper roots. Ground droughts affected the subsurface moisture layer, exactly the layer being disturbed now. She said, "How did they stop it?" Mama Tiga looked at her for a long time. Then she reached into the fold of her wrap and pulled out a small object. It was a stone disc, smooth and dark, about the size of a hand. Carved on its face was a pattern of converging lines, channels meeting at a central point. She held it out. Daisy took it carefully. The carved lines matched the topographic pattern she had sketched from field readings exactly. She said, "Where did this come from?" Mama Tiga said, "My grandmother's grandmother. She said the people who built the thing underground gave these to the families who agreed to watch it, to protect the seal points from being opened." Daisy turned the disc over. On the back, carved in very small, precise marks, was a sequence, not language, not decoration, a numerical sequence. Base 12 notation, the ancient counting system used across pre-colonial West and Central African trade networks. She showed it to Mama Tiga. "Can you read this?" The old woman shook her head. "My grandmother could. She said it was the closing instruction, the sequence you follow to reseal the chambers without collapsing the system." Daisy held the disc with both hands. Her palms were steady. Her mind was not. She said, "There are 7 chambers open, 14 more opening at dawn." Mama Tiga picked up her sorting tray again. She looked at the disc in Daisy's hands and then back at her millet. She said, "Then you have until dawn." Daisy stood. She bowed. She turned and walked quickly back toward the site. She did not run. Running in sand was inefficient, but she walked as fast as she had walked in years.
Kofi was waiting outside the work tent when she returned. She pressed the stone disc into his hands before she said a word. He looked at it. He turned it over. He saw the carved sequence, and his eyes went still in the way they did when his mind was moving fast. He said, "Base 12. She said, "Closing instructions. We need to decode them." They went inside. Kofi lit 2 oil lamps and set them at the corners of the table. He placed the disc in the center and sat down with a blank sheet of paper. Adeze watched him work. He began transcribing the sequence, converting each base 12 symbol into standard notation. She pulled out her moisture readings and laid them in order beside him. They did not speak for 20 minutes. The sequence had 48 positions. As Kofi transcribed, Adeze matched each position against her moisture readings from the 7 open chambers. A pattern emerged. Each position in the sequence corresponded to a specific pressure differential, the difference in humidity between the chamber above and the system below. She said, "It's not a fixed closing order. It's a pressure-responsive sequence." He looked up from the paper. She said, "You reseal the chambers in order of their pressure differential, lowest first. You close the least active breach before closing the most active one. Otherwise, the pressure has nowhere to go and the system ruptures." He looked at the sequence again, then at her moisture readings, then back at the sequence. He said, "That's a feedback algorithm. They built a feedback algorithm into the closing protocol." She said, "The people who built this were not primitive." He looked at her steadily. No, they weren't. He went back to the paper. She began ranking the 7 open chambers by their pressure differential readings. Chamber 4 had the lowest differential. Chamber 1 had the highest. She wrote the order: 4, 6, 3, 7, 2, 5, 1. She showed it to Kofi. He checked it against the decoded sequence. He said, "This matches exactly." She took the paper.
She folded it and put it in her shirt pocket. Then she thought about the 14 chambers opening at dawn. They were not on her moisture map yet. She did not have pressure readings for them. She said, "We need to read the scheduled breach points before dawn so we can include them in the sequence if—" She stopped. He finished her sentence. "If we can't stop the opening." She said, "The kingdom officials won't listen to us tonight. We're not their people. We have no authority here." He said, "I'm working for the Canaan Council. I have limited access." She said, "Limited is something." He stood. He picked up his commission documents from the corner of the tent. He looked at the Canaan seal on the letterhead. He said, "I can request an emergency structural safety review. It won't stop the work, but it might delay the morning breach by 2 hours." She calculated. 2 hours. If she could read the pressure differentials at all 14 scheduled breach points in 2 hours, she could complete the closing sequence before the first new chamber was opened. She said, "Request the review, now, in writing." He was already writing. She picked up her moisture meter and her notebook and walked back out into the dark. The site was quieter after dark, but not empty. Guards walked the perimeter. Maintenance workers moved between camps. A few officials sat by fires, talking. Adeze moved along the perimeter fence with her head down and her satchel over one shoulder. She looked like a technician on a late shift. Nobody stopped her. She reached the first of the 14 scheduled breach points. It was marked with a wooden skate and a small orange flag. The seal cap was intact, a dark, dense stone slab, beveled at the edges, sitting flush in the sand. She pressed her moisture meter probe gently into the sand at the cap's edge without removing the cap. Reading 66% relative humidity at 3 meters. She wrote it down. She moved to the second point. This continued for 90 minutes. She worked in a wide arc, hitting each marked point in the order she had mapped them. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was slow. She had done night field work before, in worse conditions, with worse equipment. At the 11th point, a guard stopped her. He said, "What are you doing?" She showed her water survey commission papers without hesitation and said, "Preliminary moisture assessment before tomorrow's breach procedure. Standard protocol." The guard looked at the papers. He looked at her instrument. He said, "I wasn't told about this." She said, "The Canaan structural review request went out 2 hours ago. This is part of the same procedure." He looked uncertain. Uncertain guards did not escalate. They deferred. He stepped back and let her continue. She reached the 14th point just before midnight. She took the reading and wrote it down. She stood and looked at her completed list. 21 chambers total, 7 open, 14 sealed, pressure readings for all 21. She walked quickly back to the work tent. Kofi was there. His face told her the delay had worked. He said, 2 hours and 40 minutes. I argued structural integrity concerns in the primary channel junction. They accepted the review. She sat and began integrating the new readings into the closing sequence. The base 12 algorithm had to be recalculated with 21 variables instead of 7. It took her 40 minutes. She made 3 errors and caught all 3. The final sequence had 63 steps. She wrote each one clearly on a fresh sheet of paper. Closing order by pressure differential, ascending. Chambers numbered by site map code. Chamber 11, then 14, then 6, then 9, then 3, all the way to Chamber 1, the highest pressure, to be sealed last. She handed the paper to Kofi. He studied it. He said, "The last 3 chambers in this sequence, they're the ones directly above the main junction. If the pressure isn't fully equalized by the time we get there, the caps won't hold." She said, That's why they're last. He said, and if we do this wrong? She said, we don't get a second attempt. He set the paper down on the table between them. He looked at it, then he looked at her. She said, I don't need you to feel confident, I need you to be precise. He said, those are different things. She said, yes. He picked up the paper. He said, then let's be precise.
At 2 in the morning, Kofi went to the lead Kanem official. The man's name was Counselor Bello. He was sitting in his tent with 2 advisors, reviewing tomorrow's work schedule. He was not expecting a visitor. He showed it on his face. Kofi sat across from him without being invited. He placed 3 documents on the table: his structural assessment, Adesa's pressure readings, and the deconed closing sequence. Counselor Bello looked at the documents and then at Kofi. Kofi said, the system underground is not a water delivery network. Bello said, our engineers have confirmed. Kofi said, your engineers measured surface geometry. I measured interior pressure dynamics. These are different disciplines. Bello looked at his 2 advisors. One of them shrugged. Kofi pointed to the pressure readings. At current vent rates, with 7 chambers open, you are releasing stored subsurface moisture pressure. That pressure is part of what drives convective rainfall patterns in the interior savanna. When you open 14 more chambers tomorrow, the gradient will collapse. Bello said, collapse into what? Kofi said, nothing. It will collapse into nothing. The moisture will evaporate. The system will equalize at surface level. The subsurface reserve that has been feeding interior rainfall for possibly thousands of years will be gone. The tent was quiet. Bello said, you're saying this old pipe system controls our rainfall? Kofi said, I'm saying it has been contributing to it, quietly, invisibly, for as long as it has been sealed. One of the advisors leaned forward. And the Sokoto Federation? They're opening 7 more chambers on their side at first light. Kofi said, I know. Bello sat back and looked at the ceiling of the tent. He was a practical man. Kofi had seen that in 3 weeks of work. He did not like superstition. He responded to numbers. Kofi said, I'm not asking you to stop the excavation permanently. I'm asking you to delay the morning breach by 4 hours and to allow us to reseal the 7 chambers already open in the correct sequence before anything else is touched. Bello said, and the Sokoto side? Kofi said, I will go there next. Bello looked at the closing sequence document. He picked it up and studied it. He was not an engineer, but he was a man who had spent his life reading documents that had consequences. He said, if you're wrong, you've cost me half a day and the goodwill of my workers. Kofi said, yes. Bello said, and if I'm wrong? Kofi said nothing. He let the pressure readings speak. Bello set down the document. He looked at his 2 advisors. One nodded slowly. Bello said, 4 hours. You have 4 hours to reseal the 7 chambers. After that, I review the evidence again. Kofi stood. He said, thank you. He was out of the tent and crossing. They began with Chamber 11. It was the furthest east, the lowest pressure, the first in the sequence. Adesi stood at the chamber edge, while Kofi directed 2 workers, his own, borrowed from the Kanem camp, to lift the replacement seal cap into position. The cap had been taken from a nearby unbreached section. Mamatiga had told Adesi that original material worked best. Kofi had confirmed the logic. Original material had already cured to the exact compression coefficient the system needed. They lowered the cap. Adesi checked her moisture meter. The pressure at 3 meters began to stabilize within 4 minutes. She wrote down the time and the reading. She moved to chamber 14. They worked in silence mostly. Kofi communicated with the workers through hand signals and short, specific instructions. Adaeze read and recorded after each cap was seated. Chamber 14, stable in 6 minutes. Chamber 6, stable in 3 minutes. Chamber 9, stable in 8 minutes. Chamber 3, stable in 5 minutes. There were 5 chambers down and 2 to go before the 3 high-pressure final chambers when the Sokoto workers appeared. There were 6 of them, led by a young site foreman named Danladi. He stood at the perimeter of the work area and watched them replace a seal cap with obvious anger. He said, "What are you doing to our excavation?" Kofi said, without stopping, "Structural emergency procedure, approved by Councillor Bello." Danladi said, "The Kanem Council has no authority on the Sokoto side." Kofi said, "We're on the neutral channel zone. Check your site map." Danladi looked at the ground beneath his feet. He pulled out a folded site map. He looked at it. He looked at the ground again. He said nothing. They sealed Chamber 2, stable in 4 minutes. Chamber 5, stable in 7 minutes. Now the 3 final chambers, the high-pressure ones, the ones directly above the main junction. Adaeze took new readings before they touched anything. Chamber 7, 93% humidity at 4 meters, the highest she had recorded all night. She turned to Kofi. She showed him the reading. He looked at the number. He looked at the cap that needed to go back on. The cap weighed 60 kilograms. The pressure from below would resist the placement. There was a window, a specific moment when the pressure equalized briefly between breathing cycles, when the cap could be seated cleanly. She said, "You'll feel a drop in resistance. That's the window." He said, "How long is the window?" She said, "Probably 4 seconds." He looked at the 2 workers. He explained the task to them in Hausa, slowly and without drama. They nodded. He looked at Adaeze. She put her palm against the ground beside the chamber and closed her eyes. She felt the pulse. She counted its rhythm. She said, "Now." The workers dropped the cap. It seated perfectly. She pressed her meter probe into the edge. The reading began dropping immediately. 93, 88, 81, stabilizing. She exhaled through her nose. She stood up. 2 chambers left. The last chamber was sealed at 23 minutes past 4 in the morning. Adaeze pressed her palms flat against the earth beside it and held them there for a full minute. The trembling was gone. Not suppressed, not weakened, gone. The system had returned to its operational state, pressurized, sealed, running quietly in the dark beneath the sand, doing what it had always done without anyone knowing. She stood up slowly. Her knees ached. Her hands were dusty and cold. Kofi was standing a few meters away, watching her. He had his notebook open, but he wasn't writing anything. She said, "It's stable." He said, "I know. I can feel it." She looked at him. He shrugged slightly. 14 years in structures that breathe. You start to feel when a building is comfortable. She looked out at the site. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten. The workers from both camps were gathered in a loose arc, watching them. Nobody was celebrating now. Councillor Bello stood at the front of the Kanem group. The Sokoto site foreman Danladi stood beside him, which was not something anyone had planned. Both men were looking at the line of resealed chambers. Bello said, "And the 14 scheduled breach points?" Adaeze said, "They should remain sealed, permanently." Bello said, "That is a large request." She said, "I know."
She walked to the table where Kofi had laid the topographic maps and the decoded sequence. She picked up the stone disc that Mama Tiga had given her and held it up. She said, "The people who built this made one decision at the end of their civilization. They did not bury this system because they failed. They buried it because they succeeded. They built something powerful enough to redirect rain across 400 kilometers, and they chose to seal it permanently because they couldn't agree on who deserved to benefit." She paused. Nobody spoke. She said, "They chose the land over the argument. They gave up the power because the argument about power was more dangerous than having no power at all." She set the disc down on the map. She said, "I am asking you to make the same choice." The sky was fully pink now. Birds were moving somewhere south. Danladi turned and looked at the Sokoto camp, then back at Bello. Something passed between them, not agreement exactly, but the recognition of a shared position. Bello said, "We would need to consult with the full councils." She said, "Yes, you would." He said, "Both sides." She said, "Both sides." He looked at the resealed chambers, at the smooth, undisturbed sand that now covered each one. You could not tell from the surface that anything was there. That was exactly the point. Bello said, "And this system, it continues to function, even sealed?" Adeza said, "It has been functioning for possibly 2,000 years without anyone knowing. It does not need our help. It needs our restraint." Bello looked at Danladi. Danladi looked at the ground. Then he nodded, once. Adeza picked up her moisture meter and her notebook. She packed them into her satchel. She looked at Kofi. He closed his notebook. They walked out of the site together, westward, into the early light. Behind them, the Sahel was still. The sand was pale and flat and gave nothing away. Below it, in the deep sealed dark, the ancient water moved, patient, purposeful, and mercifully forgotten by everyone except the earth itself. The sky above the interior savanna would receive its rain. Not because of any decision made that morning, because of a decision made 2,000 years ago by people who understood that the most powerful thing a civilization could do was choose what not to use.